and this is the CISOs office hours from Inversion 6. I'm Tom Siu, one of the Inversion 6 CISOs, and I have my colleague here, Tyler Hudak, who's our Director of Information. It's in response and information, I guess, in that sense. Tyler, go ahead and introduce yourself and tell our audience who you are.
Yeah, so again, I'm Tyler Hudak. I'm the Director of Incident Response at Inversion 6. Uh, Myself and my team, we're the ones who kind of get called in when somebody's having a really bad day. We come in, we help figure out what happened, and more importantly, how to kick the attackers out and get everybody back into the normal operations.
So for those of you who are not familiar with Inversion 6, what we do is, we have a fractional CISO service and incident response and a SOC service. And we all work hand in hand. Although sometimes I've worked with Tyler on some events. Your fractional CISO basically covers some of your strategic or specific elements. But it's important to always have this, I would say, reserve force ready to come in and prevent, deal with an issue as it comes along.
Right.
Usually force augmentation. Sometimes people call that staff augmentation. But what Tyler does is it brings a specific set of skills in and experience. And I'd like to share with you today, this is episode 22, by the way, of CISO's Office Hours. We are often encountering different situations, and Tyler and I were talking about it. It seemed reasonable to share with our audience. And the situation is often been when your admin suddenly becomes your adversary, or in a similar sense, the deep insider threat. We're only going to talk about one particular aspect because there's so many different ways. When you've done a lot of incidents, when you've prosecuted a bunch of incidents, I should say, you would find many different variations and twists. And part of what I do as a CISO is help people really get their incident response processes ready. And I've been in many incidents where we went to go, well, what do the logs say? And there weren't any because they never turned them on. But then Tyler walks in and finds out that the attackers had somehow erased the logs or covered their tracks. And
Right.
That's becoming increasingly better. But in this particular case, it's a situation where a company had a problem with their cloud environment. And I'll switch it over to Tyler. Maybe you can describe the background on this situation.
Yeah, so first off, I've dealt with a lot of what I would call insider threats, based attacks, and we're talking about admins here, but it really kind of comes down to the it doesn't necessarily mean a domain admin. Anybody with elevated privileges in an environment, either within the systems or the cloud, can this can happen with. In this particular instance, there was a case that we had worked where a domain admin kind of went rogue, where for whatever reason, whether they were unhappy or they were working in collusion with another attacker, which sometimes happens, the environment or the admin had gone back into the environment and opened up various kind of ports within the systems, allowing access into the cloud environment. And in turn, that allowed attackers to get in and kind of run rampant, as well as cause downtime for the organization. So in this particular case, the admin had gone in on purpose to do it. But it does happen, where, that's an accidental thing. There's a difference between malicious and negligent insider threat. In this case, we're talking about, specifically malicious.
So what, in your case, an instant response retainer type of folks would call somebody in, help us get our space back. What would you walk people through or a client through to do first? Let's take an AWS, for example. Let's say you've got an AWS environment and you don't have this person who you don't trust anymore has got the keys to your environment.
Right. That becomes even more difficult. First off, you obviously want to make sure that no one person holds the keys to the kingdom for any environment. In this particular case, the admin did have a complete control over the environment, which the client was trying to get back. When we get brought into cases like this, we're going to start asking some questions like, first off, who has access? If they're the only ones who have access, what do you have any backdoor accounts, any like fire alarm accounts that you can utilize to obtain access to get back into the environment, especially like a cloud environment? It becomes even more difficult because at that point, let's say AWS here, if they need to wrangle control back from either a malicious insider or an attacker, then they are going to probably need to call AWS or Microsoft or Google or whoever your cloud environment is through to have them help you get back into the environment. And that may not be a quick process because you're going to have to prove who you say you are. You're going to have to, work with their support. Hopefully it gets escalated properly, but that takes time to do. And there are other factors you need to keep in mind as well. For example, is this insider still working at the organization? There may be cases where companies don't want to put that person on leave or fire them until they have confirmed access back into their environment. And so you sometimes need to do this a little bit quietly. Make sure that, as much as you can, that they don't know that you're trying to gain control back into the environment out of fear that they may do something malicious to the environment.
Well, sometimes it's interesting to think about, here you are trying to do some cleanup, break glass accounts, as sometimes we call them. But that just sort of goes to my thinking, if I help you build your plan, one, have you got a way to exercise that you can use those break glass accounts? How does a vendor, let's say it's Microsoft 365, how do they really know that you're calling who you are? Because put your attacker hat on, you might be thinking, hey, let me just go spoof the admin process. There have been numerous stories in the press in the cybersecurity press about how those have been taken over. Most notably was the one from Cloudflare from 2008. Okay, I'm dating myself because they published a really great story on that when somebody basically SIM swapped the CEO, who happened to be the core admin, AT&T. Then they got the phone number routing and they said, we'll verify your phone number. No, nobody does that anymore. But you need to realize that if you don't build the bridges in your preparation space, you're going to delay the time it takes to actually connect who the real admins are, how they really know who you are, and a bunch of damage could be done by then.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And it's not something that a lot of organizations, I think, plan for. And it may not even be a malicious insider who's doing this. You may have an attacker get into like your Azure environment as a Azure administrator and then kick everybody else out. So at that point, you're kind of following through the same things. And unfortunately, that does happen, I think, more often than people think that it does. We could get into, all the recovery processes for things you need to keep in mind with that. But what it comes down to is until you get access back into that environment, you can't really do anything. And you're basically under the, whim isn't the right word, but you're kind of relying upon the vendor to get you access back. And unfortunately, it all depends on what level of support you're paying for it at times. What their SLAs are. It could take a little bit.
Well, I can think of two incidences. One is if you have an admin, but you have another admin account or an account with the same amount of privilege that the core admin can't remove. That would be something to establish. And then, you've got to have some MFA for that that's separate. But you also have to go back and revoke those access tokens for that admin. Remembering that this person is going to be suffering longer consequences, and sometimes maybe they don't care. Right. And how do you address that risk? Obviously, that's a people management thing, not a technology thing. But what we're talking about now is, at least that's where my focus is. Yours may be how to get out of the predicament. Mine is how to keep out of the predicament. And so these things do fuse together. It's really useful for you as a cybersecurity practitioner to talk with your incident response folks to say, and dig through your lessons learned.
Yeah.
And other people's lessons learned, ideally, to say, here's why we want to put this extra set of tools in place. Um, what if you don't have a privileged account that you can switch?
That, I mean, again, it kind of comes back to, you're going to have to, when we're talking cloud environments, you're going to have to work with the vendor to get that access, to get a new admin account created in there. Hopefully, you do have something. I have run into instances where there was only, for whatever reason, one administrative account. And I mean, regardless of, if we're talking insider threat or not, that's a single point of failure that is going to hurt any company. I mean, what would happen if the person who owns that account, leaves, or, the traditional gets hit by a bus? Who knows the credentials to that? Probably, no one. And so it becomes, a bit more difficult to get back into systems.
Well, I think that's the key piece that you need in every incident response plan. Who's the contact at your support vendor?
Yeah.
How do they verify who you are? Usually through account and billing.
Yeah.
If the company's big enough, whoever pays the bill usually gets to say. If you send kids to college, you're supposed to have that same rule. I pay the bill, I get to have a say what's going on here. But
Right.
that's another story. We won't go there. But the idea is to be able to prove your ownership, and
Yeah.
this is a specifically challenged. I've noticed for a couple of companies who've had acquisitions and purchases, or divestitures as well. They have to go back and rebuild new relationships with the vendors if they maintain those services as their new company.
Yeah.
Um, and the email address is not always the most obvious thing, but it's the first start. I'm sure it's part of the whole mix of how they can prove the identity.
Yeah, and I think too, it kind of comes down to, if definitely documenting who to call, but in cases like that, you probably have a sales rep who may be able to get you faster support in an emergency case like this than the support team can. Because when you call into support, you're probably going to be dealing with the level 1 support first, and then they have to escalate it, and then they have to escalate it, and that takes time. By calling your sales rep, I think that they may be a little bit more willing to kind of escalate things faster, because in the end, it also means that it affects their bottom line if you decide that they didn't move fast enough and you move away.
So let's go ahead. Let's say you've successfully got back ownership of your
Yeah.
environment. What do you think people ought to be doing then?
So, if we're looking at a malicious insider who took control of your environment, or restricted access, the next step after you gain control back is to figure out what did they do. Unfortunately, I have worked those cases where a malicious insider puts time bombs into a organization's systems, so that at some point in the future, malicious code is going to run. I remember one case that I worked where it was actually a database administrator who was unhappy, and so they put scheduled tasks in multiple database servers around the environment to basically drop all of the databases in those databases, in all the tables and all the data and so on. It happened like once or twice, which is how the company found out about it. And then our job was to go through and figure out where else did they do this. The job also involved us doing a forensic analysis on that person's computer, which we were able to then find the proof that they were the ones who did it, because the malicious code was on there. We actually found multiple versions of the malicious code that they were writing, and so on. But really, it comes down to, what did they do in that environment? Did they put those time bombs in? Did they exfiltrate data? Did they add in backdoor accounts, and so on? You have to treat it almost like a real, or not almost, you have to treat it like a real compromise, because you did have somebody malicious in there. And in insider threat cases, I think it becomes a little bit more urgent, or important for you to go in and do that analysis, because that individual likely had high level of access within that environment, and the knowledge of that environment that an attacker typically does not have. They know all the ins and outs of that environment, and so they can get in very deep if they want to.
It seems like there are what's old is new, and what's new is old. I heard a few years ago a series of podcasts from the Software Engineering Institute and the CERT-CC,
Mhm.
and they had done a research study, and I don't have the exact name right here on top of my head. Maybe I'll post it in the notes here. But they interviewed insiders who were in jail.
Okay.
They've been caught and prosecuted, and these insiders had a list of things that you should do to keep guys like me from doing what I did. And one of them is make them take vacation, so
Yeah.
that because usually, and these were like insider trading people losing money and they're hiding it, in terms of money and financial systems because they run the IT environments, and they never take vacation because someone might find their whole code. But now I think about is if I could use the company's AI environment to run APIs, that could also pretty much run any old time. And if your AI code, your AI systems read prompts in your database, that'd be an interesting way to mess up your environment. But I think it'd also be a good way that you could also police your environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when it comes down to, AI is a great correlation and automation tool. The more access you give it in your environment, the more that somebody can do with it. In fact, in theory, it's going to make, an insider's job much easier because they may not need to know all of the details, especially for stealing data. AI makes it very easy to query the data for both good and bad purposes.
So in this particular case, how did the example that we were discussing? Um, how long did it take the company to get back? How long was their outage?
Fortunately, in this case, that it wasn't too bad. They were only out for like maybe a day or two before they were able to get control back of the environment. I've worked with other companies that have longer downtime. I remember working one case where, again, it was actually a administrator who had been let go.
Okay.
Then they did not, the company did not revoke their access right away. And this is, another thing that, companies should do. If you're going to let somebody go, revoke their access before you do that. But they did not do that, and the administrator came in later that night, opened up a bunch of ports so that they could access some systems, and it just led to systems going down, issues and so on. And in that case, they were down for about a week. In this case, the malicious insider, the admin, wasn't necessarily doing anything malicious on purpose, but just as a consequence of the actions that they performed and trying to get back in to get the whatever data that they wanted to, it ended up causing longer term issues for the organization. And I would even say it causes long term costs as well, because now the organization realizes that they have all these gaps. They need to fix those gaps. Most of the time, it's going to cost them money in order to do that, in order to put in the access control that they need that they didn't have before, to put in maybe some technology stops or protections to prevent it from happening, some things to detect, and so on. And so, not to say that they shouldn't have it already, but it is something that happens with these as well.
Well, it seems like you could use the classic fraud detection things if management is paying attention. And if you're a cybersecurity leader, you should be paying attention to your people as much as you are to your systems and reports. But where you the famous line from Ronald Reagan, which is another quote: "Trust but verify."
Right.
Part of it is you put blocks into your environment so that your admins know that you're watching. Now you're not watching for evil; you're watching for mistakes at first. But you should also be paying to motivation, opportunity, and access.
Yeah.
And sometimes if there's no access or restricted access, motivation and opportunity get really small on that calculus. But I like the idea of thinking, you know, no more than one. If you have a single point of failure, you're really throwing the risk out there. You need to have more than two people who can do this, or maybe two-person integrity is what we did back in the Navy. Have you heard of that?
I have. I've actually worked a couple cases where the organization, had that in place. The one I'm thinking of was more of a fraud case, where there was that almost like two-person validation process that they had in place, but the fraud still happened. And so, my primary purpose was to determine, is there a way that we can figure out if there was collusion going on between these two?
All right. It had to
In the
be. Mhm.
in
It
the end, we
basically
weren't able
requires
to.
collusion in order to do the problem.
Right, exactly. In the end, we weren't able to show collusion because, first off, that's difficult to do unless somebody types an email that says, "Hey, let's do this. We're going to work together to commit this fraud," which you rarely, at least in my cases, happens. But it is something to look at, and sometimes you need to have that maybe a third party involved in there, or like you said, having making somebody take vacation, because if one of those two people go on vacation and their backup fills in, their backup may find that, hey, something's not quite right here.
Not just because I don't like the way you code, but these are wrong. Yeah, so that sense you have to have some sort of redundancies in your admin layer, maybe two independent break glass accounts,
Right.
and maybe even three. So at least you, with your vendor, you have to have two of the three combined in order to reset your environment. Multi-person approval. That was the two-person integrity. We had safes with two combinations on it.
Okay.
Half the people knew one combination, the other half of the people knew the other combination, and you had to pull people from those two pools in order to open the safe. And that's the same sort of thing you might have, is like some people know this and some people know that, but you need somebody from each of those in order to open the big deal. Now that makes inhibitions on timing, but you have to plan ahead. The idea is to prevent the fraud from happening, or the bad event. What's different about cloud services, though? Have you seen that? I mean, I'm thinking AWS. I had an environment where we had a vendor ran the AWS for us, and we never really got to see the control tower or the landing zones. We were just downstream from that, and the problem with that was we weren't monitoring those. The vendor was, and we'd have cost overruns that were amazing because it wasn't part of our scan because we couldn't see it. So I think about that experience, and I wonder about what a company needs to think about when they run these cloud environments.
I mean, that is a really good point, because if you're not running the cloud environment yourself, like with what you just mentioned, you may have less visibility than you think you do. One of the things that I often run into, especially in like tabletop exercises or even in incidents, are company has a cloud service that they subscribe to or they utilize, and there's an incident, the attacker accesses, or the attacker or malicious insider accesses that environment, and so we go to the vendor who is controlling all this and say, hey, we need the data to see what this user account accessed, and they come back and say, we don't keep that data. And so at that point, there's not much we can do. In incident response, I wish I had that magic button which would give me the data that I wanted. Unfortunately, that does not yet exist. But that's one of the big issues, is when somebody else is controlling your environment, then you have to you're kind of relying upon them to be doing the right things, unless you're kind of auditing them upfront or during the time you're working with them. I would also say that in terms of like the insider threat, you're kind of expanding your risk a little bit when you are using third parties, especially cloud providers, because now you're not only worried or have to be concerned about your own internal people, you now have to be concerned about the people who are working in that environment, and do they have any insiders that are going to become threats to your organization. I've seen this in some ways, not in the, I think, traditional way that you would think about insider threat, but more supply chain compromises, where a provider gets compromised, attacker comes in through that provider's access, but it in a way that still is kind of an insider threat, because it is a third party, but they're still trusted into your environment. So in a way, they're kind of like an insider.
So when you have these particular cases, obviously you're doing the cleanup. I've suggested many people work out their SOP on in their incident response plan on how to recover their cloud environment.
Yeah.
This is pretty common with credential theft and session token theft. If they can session token theft the admin to your let's call it the Microsoft 365 environment,
Mm-hmm.
there's specific things you need to be able to do and do them in order. And I think that particular checklist has been quite absent from a number of incident response plans or even sub procedures that I've reviewed and helped clients with. What do you think that people need to do in terms of incident response planning to plan against this type of situation?
To plan against the loss of the data in the cloud, you mean, or
Yes, or loss of the admin control. I mean,
ah
part of it could be, the attacker gets in and steals it, but I'm thinking the insider is just as good as the attacker if
yeah.
they own the domain.
I mean, it kind of comes down to I think that there are probably two things that you would need to plan for. The first would be having that break glass account that hopefully the attacker doesn't find or the malicious insider doesn't disable, so that you can get that enabled, get into back into the environment. But if not, and at least in a lot of the cases that I've worked, that probably wouldn't work. But then having that plan for, let's assume that we have completely lost access to Azure or AWS or what environment we're talking about. How do we get back in? And then, just like we talked about before, who are you going to call? What are their SLAs? So that, yeah, we're going to call them, but they may have a day to get this done. And it's that weekend and holiday work is excluded. So this would actually be a really great tabletop exercise for a company to walk through. This is one that you could probably do easily within an hour, because I have a feeling that if once you start talking about this situation, a lot of organizations, the people around the table are going to start giving you blank looks, and decide that this is a resume generating event, that there's really nothing that they have planned for. But in the end, it comes down to, who are you going to contact?
Well, great. So that pretty much wraps it up for today. Tyler, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah.
If you have more questions, you can reach out to us at invergent6.com. Also, one of the mandatory items is to like and click the bell and follow us. And we'll keep providing you as much pertinent and conversational information as possible. But the idea is we want to stimulate your thinking about, hey, did you really get into this? Have you thought about this in your incident response planning or your post incident? How am I going to call for help? And what can I do to make sure that is smooth? And then if you need more help, you can call us here again at invergent6.com. And until next time, thank you, Tyler, for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you.